'Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you won't see the show on your TV, so we talk about things musically. 'Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you're listening to Jams and Tea.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And on this week's Record Club, we are talking about my recommended album, which is Iridescence by Brockhampton. This is an album.
People got to show them off.
Might be giving away the game early, but it's no secret that I'm a Brockhampton fan. I've mentioned it like a couple times, but like not nearly enough to indicate the ravenous, rabid fanboyism that I exude for this particular group. I'm sure everybody in this fucking call is probably sick to death of me talking about it, but we haven't had an opportunity to talk about them on the show yet. And I wanted to give myself that opportunity just because it felt like there was a hole in my life. I need to talk about all the things. And B, we are in kind of an interesting era in their output, and that Brockhampton are still very much an active group, but we don't really know what is on the horizon for them just because they have been so wildly unpredictable. We are supposedly on the way to a new album. We do not know when it will come out. We just know that it does indeed exist. Hopefully it will come out this year. Yeah. And to provide a little bit of context, as I mentioned in the main episode, I did do a very brief review of the first 3 Saturation albums on this channel. Go check them out if you want to get up to speed. Sort of creates a little contextual bubble for you knowing where this is coming from, but I will still set the stage because the story of Iridescence is almost as important as the music itself. In fact, they're both interlocked, I guess, in a very inescapable way. So brief rundown. Brockhampton, they are a group of multimedia artists who met through a Kanye West fan forum in the mid-2000s, and basically they got together and they just decided that they wanted to make music. Each of them had sort of kind of a minor musical career going on that was very DIY in their own respect. The most successful member is frontman Kevin Abstract, who had some solo work that caught the attention of some people before, but so he's kind of been the ringleader, as it were. They dropped an EP called All American Trash prior to their album run, which didn't really make like waves or anything. It was basically just an announcement that all of these sort of underground musicians were going to be collaborating together, but it wasn't really good enough to the point where it created or generated a lot of hype for the group. So then they all got together in South Central California, and in the span of 1 year released 3 records, Saturation Trilogy, which was them basically just cranking out content. It was all of these people collaborating, producers, graphic designers, writers, rappers, everything, them making as much high quality content as humanly possible. And it caught on in a really big way. I remember being there for the Brockhampton like moment when those albums were coming out. Like right after the first one came out, there was announced to be 2 more. So it was like a thing back in that particular year. And so once it was over, they signed a record deal to RCA, and nobody really knew what to expect because they did such a mammoth project in such a small amount of time that it's sort of like, where do you even go from here? You've created 3 successful albums. You're at the height of your popularity. What are you going to do now? And they're an eclectic group who have influences from all over the place. So it's like, are they just going to do more of the same? Are they going to try and branch off a little bit? Nobody knew. So they decided to do their album rollout the following year, and they released some singles, notably songs like 1999 Wildfire, Truman, and I can't remember the name of the last one. 3 good songs that were supposed to be on the album that I believe was called Team Effort at the time, which was the first.
It was Team Effort, and then it was Puppy, and then it was, I think, those singles specifically were arising out of an era that they were calling the best years of our lives, which is what the titles of the singles alluded to.
Yeah, the best was what the album was called when they played Tanya on
Kimmel or Fallon, one of the Jimmys.
Fallon. And this is actually, they used that. The albums that they made afterwards, starting with Iridescence, this is the Best Years of Our Lives trilogy, and Iridescence is the first album in that trilogy, supposedly. But as said and alluded to, the album that was Team Effort, that was done by all accounts, it was a finished product, stopped. Because noted member and one of the leading personalities of Brockhampton, Amir Van, was ousted from the group. The band put out sort of a statement saying that they had been lied to by Amir regarding some things in regards to his past, which he had been open about on the albums. It's just that at least the impression that I get from all of that news happening was in fact that they were sort of allowing him to turn over a new leaf and put some of the darker stuff behind him. But this, in combination with an incident that is elaborated upon on Ginger, where Don McLennan found out that Amir set up one of his friends to be robbed, allegedly, and that is its own story that has its own separate thing. But
I would say that's a piece of context that's maybe not necessary for this, because we didn't know it until long after this album came out.
No, I just wanted to say this was still something that played an effort into everything that followed it. It was still something that did happen. It was basically them saying that, like, I think the impression here is that some people took this statement to be like, oh, the band was hiding something, or that they knew about something bad that Amir did and they were like keeping it from people. And that's not really what I think they wanted to get across from the actual wording of the statement itself. It really came across more as he was not honest to us about some of the things that he did, and as a result, we have expelled him from the group because this sort of thing is not in keeping with their brand. Brockhampton are a rap group that is built...
especially after a song like Junkie, you can't let what.
Well, a necessary piece of the puzzle here is the fact that there were some very serious sexual, what's the right word? Sexual misconduct allegations that were leveled at Amir specifically. That were, at least, we don't know what the process was in terms of how the band were dealing with the decision, but that was what was in the public consciousness at this time. And that was what was causing a lot of fracture with regard to Brockhampton's audience and Brockhampton.
Yes, that was like, it was a whole to-do, and it basically completely uprooted them from what they were doing in that moment, because the project they had just worked on was a project that did indeed have Amir on it. So basically what happened was they were just sort of stuck. They were announcing a new record, it was going to come out, and now they had nowhere to go and nothing to do, and they were like, well, we need to do something. And from that particular struggle and all of that strife and all of that, like, that fallout went out over like the course of a month, and it was really rough and ugly there for a while. And it also, you know, just didn't help that, like, this was the thing that Brockhampton had built their brand on, is being people who were vulnerable, being people who spoke to victims of abuse and victims of mental illness and all these kinds of things. So ousting Amir was really, I think, a good faith showing on their part that that just wasn't something they wanted to be associated with them. So then they go to, in conjunction, they go to Abbey Road, as well as the Brockhampton sort of workshop studio in Hawaii, and recorded all of Iridescence on Abbey Road and like half on their studio. And this was recorded, I believe, over the course of like a week and a half, I think. And then it was sort of put out there, and then the Iridescence rollout began. They had merch, they had all this stuff, and the record just kind of dropped. And I won't go into any more historical context just because there isn't any more, but I do think it's worth noting that one of the reasons that I wanted to cover this is because not only is this a controversial release in the respect of the story behind it is kind of interesting and kind of whacked out, is that the album itself is incredibly divisive. It has its vocal advocates, myself and many podcast mates here fall into that category, but it is also generally rarely considered to be the worst and or weakest Brockhampton album. It's looked at as kind of a black sheep amongst their other records. Even Ginger, which got comparatively more lukewarm reception than the Saturation albums, is still looked at a lot more fondly, just because Iridescence is clearly a more scattered, a more messy sort of affair that maybe wasn't as fully formed as their other previous ideas. And thus, I think it makes an interesting opportunity to discuss it, just because there's a lot of emotionally volatile things here. There's a lot of pieces and edges and things that make this whole situation and this whole album sound very emblematic of what all of that was in the first place. And I think that's something that people sort of fail to acknowledge about Iridescence, is that it is very much structured and built to be the dark Black Mirror image of a Saturation album. It is structured like them, save for the extraneous skits, which I think makes it better. But that's still, this is sort of an viewed as something that's slapdash, and I don't disagree with that entirely, but I also think that that is part of the intent, that some of the wonkiness is inherent with what they're trying to do. And yeah, that leaves us here to talk about it.
Just before we leap into the review, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about the context, because most of us experienced Brockhampton as Saturation happened and lived through the rollout of this record. And I mean, in my perspective anyway, it felt as though leading up to it, people, especially following the fallout from the Amir situation, people were kind of expecting the band to fail. There was this sense in the air that because of the Amir situation, having nothing to do with the band's creativity or ability, it was simply that something had been soiled, something had been lost. They would never be able to see this band in the same light again. These records that they had made, that had spoken to so many people who were marginalized, who were hurt, and then these records turned out to be dominated by this figure. I mean, not dominated, but that was at least the perception anyway. This figure throughout them who appeared on their album covers, who was this person who turned out to have done some quite horrible things, and really has shown, it is also worth saying, showed no real atonement for them at all.
In fact, quite the opposite, considering the last release from this, from Amir being very vocally against what the band did and what the band said, and basically trying to deny any form of accountability.
And so there was a sense, my point being, there was a sense for a lot of fans, even if this wasn't a feeling that I particularly shared, there was a sense for a lot of fans that this band was in some way just soiled now, and that there was a desire to kind of move on from them. And a lot of people have expressed a feeling that something in particular was lost after the Saturation trilogy. And I don't think, knowing these records as well as I do, I don't think it really has anything to do with the musical quality of what followed the Saturation trilogy, but simply that quality of Saturation itself, of being so, with 2017 being a year so dominated by this band absolutely reaching stratospheric heights and then fracturing in this dramatic way, it just set up a whole different perception of the group, and whether fairly or not, and of course we'll all argue that's unfair considering how arguably well they dealt with it. But also I think perhaps some of it was exacerbated by the fact that the situation with Amir is not really acknowledged on Iridescence.
No, it's acknowledged on Ginger, in fact, but not on Iridescence.
It's talked about on Ginger to an extent, so perhaps there is a sense that, I don't know, these aren't feelings that I share, but I have tried to understand why there has been this massive online shift in the way that this band is considered, to the point where we are a year and 5 months, I think, not even a year and a half out from their last record, and people are saying stuff like, remember Brockhampton? And it's like, we have not, the period of time that has elapsed since they were in the public consciousness is less than most gaps between releases for most artists.
Right. And well, it's not just that, but in 2020, they dropped like 5 double singles, I think, and they had a web show. So it's not like they haven't made themselves present.
Yeah. Anyway, I think I've kind of probably spent enough talking about this now, but I think it's something we'll probably come back to throughout this discussion.
It's also just worth noting that Iridescence and Ginger were both albums that did remarkably well financially, and both of them charted very well. Iridescence actually was like, I think, a #1 album for a brief period of time when it was released. So it's not like their success diminished.
Yeah, no, certainly. They certainly have a really vocal and hardcore and beloved fan base, which is always really heartening to see. I still visit the Brockhampton subreddit from time to time, and I'm still like, and I still love how active that is. And I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to the next album rollout, and I am very excited to see how it goes. But anyway, we're on Iridescence now. We've given plenty of context. Very curious to hear what Morgan you have to say about this particular record, considering I know you've been a long-time fan as well.
Yeah, since release day, in fact. I was aware of Brockhampton up to this point. It was hard to be on the internet and running in music-related circles without hearing about the Saturation trilogy to some degree.
And having a best friend that never shut the fuck up about it.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but yeah, I wasn't really listening to hip-hop at the time. I was 18 and 18. And at the point that this released, I was just like, all right, there seems to be a lot of hype about this. I'd obviously heard about everything with Amir and had kind of slowly watched after that as sort of people not just like, it's not just that people were convinced that after Amir had been exiled in the manner of speaking, no, it's not so much that they were convinced that it would fail. It's that some people felt like they were actually actively rooting for it to fail.
Yeah.
Which I found strange, especially considering the things that Amir did, and just, I don't know, very weird thing that I was like detached from, but watching as a third party. So it's just like, all right, I'll give this record a shot. And I think it actually may have been the day before it came out, because Jake sent me some leaks.
It was.
Yeah. And I put it on, and the first thing I hear is New Orleans. And I'm just like, yeah. Yeah. I should say so, Mr. McLennan. Yeah, just a fucking banger. Just really horrid stuff. And I have, again, I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that really. It was yeah. So that's a sort of a tone setter. That's what they establish there, as if you're listening for the first time, probably the mood of it to some degree. And then right after that is Thug Life, which is not anything like New Orleans. It's this really soulful, beautiful sort of R&B type song. It's only 2 minutes, but is among the most captivating portions of the album by far, I would say. Well, probably
It's
not
like,
by far. It's not like this really has...
It's pretty in a way that I would say none of the rest of the record is. Well, there are moments on the rest of the record, like the string flourishes and stuff, that are very pretty, but there's no song, I think, that is as consistently beautiful as this one.
Yeah, I would say that's true. So just immediately thrown for a loop again. And also, like, I don't, why am I crying in the club right now? What is this?
The answer is Dom McLennan.
Yeah, and yeah, it's these. Another thing that you notice by this point is that the pen game of everyone whose voice is on this record is kind of outrageous.
Yeah.
Like, it's stupid. It's actually stupid.
A little bit annoying. Let me pull some of this up here. I should have done this.
I'm not going to front here. A lot of what I have to say is going to devolve into me just reading some verses because that is the only way I can properly convey how powerful this shit is.
As I've said previously, the amount of 10 out of 10 verses Don McLennan has across the Brockhampton career is unfair to almost every other rapper who has ever worked.
Yes. Yes.
The beautiful thing about Dom is that he doesn't open his mouth unless he has something to say.
Damn straight.
And that's how you get such consistency.
And then what he says is just like a damn spilling over of fucking bars.
On his verses, it's not like any couplet is outstandingly incredible. It's just the whole thing is consistently wonderful and says something when he does the verse.
I got it up now. It's different reconciling with skeletons I ain't know I possessed. I saw perfection out in ways I no longer accept. And it's like, let's take this as an example right here. Yes, this record never does acknowledge Amir in any direct way, but it's just completely he is all over this record without literally being
the spirit
so in the way
of
that
loss.
Used to be.
Well, and especially if you go straight from the Saturation trilogy to this, it's just like the absence is so apparent.
It's like Metallica's "And Justice for All," quite frankly.
A little bit, and that makes so much sense.
I can't believe I only just now thought of that. Holy shit.
Wow. Anyway, after that is Berlin, which yet again, just another complete throw for a loop. This is where you start to see and sort of empathize with the people who think this album is a fucking mess. And
it totally is, but like it just depends.
I think that's almost
how you feel about that.
I think at this point it's almost irrefutable to say that it isn't a mess.
Yeah.
But that's everything is a mess. That's the point.
It doesn't matter.
Their life is a mess. That's what the album is about. If this album was unified, it would cut its message in its themes down in a significantly impactful way. When we get to Wait. I don't want to waste no more time.
Wait's an example of a song that just comes at you with like half a dozen of the most like holy shit moments in the band's discography and just piles them on top of each other.
Wait is the mission statement for the entire record. It's just like, here is what this is sonically, and then Wait is just like, here is this emotionally, and that's the rest of the album.
And then it's like, this isn't in my top 3 tracks on the album, but like the beat drop in Wait is like top 5 moments in music of the 2010s for me. Like, it just, yeah.
And like the fucking vinyl scratches as well, which I don't know who does those. I think I definitely read some anyway. The vinyl scratches are amazing. The vocal vinyl scratches in the tracks. Such a cool touch. Apparently used with a piece of tech, created with a piece of tech that was also used by the Beatles on Sgt. Pepper's, which is a fun fact I learned while researching this album.
It feels like it easily feels like something that could be kind of dated if they used it, but it feels so contemporary and urgent and proper. Like it's something like you wouldn't have thought of, but like now that you know it's there, it's like you can't do without it.
Yeah, like it's fucking. It just this track just explodes into a drum and bass breakdown. Like I can't say I was expecting Brockhampton to do that, but I'm always fucking here for when current acts incorporate fucking 2000s drum and bass sounds into their music.
And the 1-2 punch of Joba and Dom's verses that like just whole, like Joba specifically on this album, dude was kind of like on the Saturation albums, Joba was just sort of like the token kind of crazy person. Like he obviously had more depth than that, but that was just sort of his personality.
Crazy white boy.
I mean, and then Joba comes onto this album. He comes on to Iridescence, and I'll speak more to this later, but it's just Joba comes on to Iridescence, and he is just like, it is the most insane glow up of artistic capability I think I have ever seen in my life. Joba fucking owns Iridescence. It's insane.
It's difficult not to think of him as the MVP of the record, in the same way that I think that Bearface is the MVP of Ginger, for instance. It's an example of an artist who has always had talent and displayed it, but really gets to just kind of not only come to the fore, but also give new layers to what you would expect from them in ways that are really kind of, whoa, okay, this is really startling. And he really kind of just dominates the album in so many ways.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to not roll up to every Brockhampton album and say Don McLennan is the MVP. But insofar as that goes, Joba is like, especially like his verse on Jouvert is like,
it is the angriest I have ever heard anyone sound in a hip hop song ever.
It's the angriest I've heard anyone in music. He sounds like I did that time in the car when we were talking about The Last Jedi and the blue titty milk.
Oh my God, he does!
Yeah. It's
a testament to how much he dominates this record that verse is not even one of the top 3 verses he gives on this album.
Yeah, I'd say it's his second best, honestly.
It's pretty fucking great. Hard to deny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, after Wait, we get District, which is just another fucking banger, and that's something that I feel the Iridescence discourse does not talk about enough.
Thank you.
It's just how much this album, for all its sort of contemplative moodiness, how much of it just fucking goes, because it just goes, and like it's just immaculately produced. And it sounds amazing. Like I don't know shit about hip hop production, and I didn't when I first listened to it. I knew less than shit about hip hop production because I know shit now, and I knew less than shit then. But even then, I was just like, how do humans make these noises? Because it's grimy as hell, but like it's fully catchy and like engaging and never even vaguely off-putting. It's like, it reminds me a lot of what like my favorite industrial albums do in that sense. Even though I wouldn't describe this as industrial.
The spirit is there though. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, I was
an interlude. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna second it and say there are definitely points where it seems like they're going for a sound that's deliberately off-putting or deliberately jarring. I think Berlin's maybe the strongest example on the record, but District also works as well, where it's like the whole point or the whole philosophy of the record is to make people uncomfortable, to even upset people. Just to get you in the sense of to approximate the state of mind they were in making the record as well, and to induce that in their listeners in some way to really kind of make you feel almost unwell. For example, the best example of this, I think, is maybe not the best example. One thing comes to mind is the bass tone on Juvere, which is so unsettlingly heavy and just oppressive in the background of the song.
Thick.
It's beyond thick. It's just kind of like, it's like a shepherd tone, if you know.
Right.
Like, it just makes me feel ill. And I think that's kind of the whole, and there are definitely parts of the record where they deviate from that, but a general theme seems to be creating a sound design that does that.
Yeah.
Loophole is an interlude that is backed by audio clips from I was just looking at this, a 2016 interview between rapper Cameron and DJ Woo Kid. I don't know who these people are, but like, it's a very pertinent conversation to the record, is what I'll say. And it's, I think, an interesting example of an interlude being kind of integral to the structure of an album, especially after that. Like, instrumentally, it makes a really nice bridge between the first and second halves, but I think with the audio clips they play over it, it sort of really ties everything together really nicely.
And there's definitely, I think, significance of the track being backed by a string sample from Wait as well, kind of tying.
Yeah. There are interpolations of many saturation songs on this album that, like, I did not realize happened. Like, the obvious one is Bump at the very end of, I think it might be Jovert. But like, it's super obvious, but they are all.
Oh, he's dead. Yeah, after that we get into the second half of the album with just fucking highlight tape.
Yes.
Which is a song that feels a bit like a manic spiral. And is a little bit, I mean, it's almost uncomfortable to listen to at points, but it's also just so, again, it just sounds so immaculate for what it's going for, that like you can't look away. And pretty much, I mean, nearly all of the contributing members vocally, I think with the exception of Bareface, are on here.
Yeah.
And every single one kills it. Just like some of the best verses of Brockhampton are all on this song. Like, everybody is in
Joba, man.
Here. Yeah.
Jesus. Might be the best on the album, really.
Yeah, I was going to say, no, I'm already kind of spilling points from my review, but this is probably my favorite Joba verse on the record, on tape.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, actually, I'm not even sure about that now when I think about it. There's another verse later on that I want to get to, but anyway.
For the record, I like how conversational this has been so far. So, I mean, there's anybody got anything, just throw it out there, because I'm quite literally making this shit up as I go along.
While we're just on it, so I don't have to come back to it, I'm just going to read part of this just to convey, like, just so this doesn't come across as like, you know, we have receipts for our feelings here, audience. Joba's verse. Flicking on the face of my wristwatch, watch the time stop to speed up, watch life unfold, and between the tick-tocks, speeding down the one way, fuck these signs, fuck these lights, put my life on the line. When it feel right, I'm fine. No, I'm lying. Don't ask me. I'll pay the fine. I'll pay the toll. Just hope I don't crash it. But if I do, it will be a blaze of glory, engulfed by the manifestation of death behind me. All my life, I felt inadequate, and through the years, I've dealt with tragedy after tragedy. God, send me a message. Send a messenger my way. Never claimed to be a saint. Forgive me. Feel like the light that I've been blessed with has diminished. I'm haunted by the visions of my youth turned true. I've come to expect my expectations aren't true, but I'm a master of believing my lies, and you can't break me, and I can't break at the speed of light.
Yeah, like that's a very dramatic verse, and that kind of dramatic, some might even say histrionic energy is just all over this record, particularly in what Joba and Dom like to rap about, and the energies they kind of channel. Yeah, that's, I think, an exemplary verse.
The delivery too is what half makes it, because it's like it's so different from how Joba's ever sounded on a Brockhampton record up until this point that it just sticks with you even more. And I can never ever get past the lines of feel like the light that I have been blessed with has diminished.
Really?
That hits me fucking hard,
especially on the record where he is performing the best he has done.
Yeah, I know, right? You're just like that's the album in a nutshell. It's like them being at the height of their technical skill and feeling like they're not good enough.
Like literally me for the whole of this record is remembering watching the Saturation doc that came through free with the box set, which I didn't own, but it was on YouTube, and it's a feature-length documentary which is excellent about the making of the Saturation trilogy. And Joba says to Kevin around Saturation 3, look, I'm nervous about rapping because I'm a singer. I'm not a rapper. And I'm just like, I've heard Iridescence, Joba. I know what you can do.
I think something else that verse kind of taps into a little bit that is particularly devastating is the notion that tragedy and just kind of general personal turmoil might bring out the best in Joba as a performer.
And how fucked that is.
Yeah, exactly. And that notion that, you know, what is the motivation to perform if it means having to dredge through my worst feelings or draw from them in a way that's kind of means I have to continue going back to them.
Right. And look, believe me, that's a struggle that I particularly have a lot of relationship to.
If you have ever created anything in your life, this will speak to you.
Yeah. It's like what Joba's verse reminds me of, what his verse on tape specifically reminds me of, is there was a period after Jake finished his half of the fantasy novel that we were working on together.
I'm glad you thought about this, Mord, because I thought about it too, honestly.
Yeah, because he's just, you know, we had long talks about that. And after he finished it, I think it was just essentially burnout because it was like a 1,200-page book. And he was like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And I was like, well, you're the best now that you ever have been at it. So like that would piss me off, so to speak.
That encouragement meant a lot to me, because let me tell you, when you've ever finished a good project and you feel like you don't want to do it anymore, it's really hard to step away from that.
Yeah.
Especially when it's done, like you don't have any like.
Yeah, I wrote the biggest thing ever in 2 months, and I was just like, wow, I don't know if I want to do this anymore.
No, that's the feeling that Joe really expressed as well.
Yeah, it's like this notion of like when you put your whole self into a work of art, when you like put so much of your life into something, or so much personal energy into something, as the Saturation trilogy must have required for them in such a short amount of time. There's that notion of finishing that and then thinking, well, you know,
what now?
I'm so fucking exhausted. How do I go? Yeah. What do I do next? How do I continue that? And this is a record that feels just covered in that feeling of like, well, where next? I think of it as a transitional album through and through, and that's a kind of term that maybe has some negative connotations, but I think it is just what this is. And it in terms of examining what it means to kind of, I'm talking out my ass now, but like moving forward from such a gigantic success, because like it may not seem like it, but this is, I mean, really, if you think about it, this is their sophomore record, because the Saturation trilogy is just this one unified thing, and this is a kind of beautiful emblematic example of the struggle of choosing your direction, moving forward. And I need to shut up.
Yeah, no, you're right. Exactly right. Because when you put it in that context, and where Saturation is to Iridescence, the quandary faced in terms of creativity that is so clear on Iridescence is something I have thought almost every other minute about for the last 2 weeks. And it's all over this record.
It's just filled with apprehension. There's just such a palpable sense of like everybody who is a part. It also just like Iridescence in general is like it props up how much of a miracle the Saturation albums were, just because it's like now that was them at the height of their power of just like using everything they could and trying to come out the gate swinging and like building off of a rock solid foundation. But there's also the fact that this band is 14 fucking people. What happens when you throw 14 fucking people who are all emotionally volatile into a state where they have to make music based on the fact that they feel like shit? It's gonna be chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I've talked on here before about my first semester of college at a university that I left before the semester actually finished. And yeah, that was the fall semester of 2018, and this album came out September 21st of 2018. And it was I'd been there a month, maybe a little more. And it was definitely in the time before everything kind of came crashing down in that era. But I think San Marcos is a really good illustration of what iridescence means to me, which is to be on the cusp of something very important, or even to be after it in some ways, to be in the place after something very important and dealing with the aftermath of it. I think so much of the album really exemplifies that to me, especially San Marcos, where it's this sort of reconciliation by that point of like, you know, it's the refrain, I want more out of life than this. Just this album, aside from like one or two moments, is essentially flawless to me. And I would go so far as to say it probably is my favorite of theirs. And it will also issue the declaration that I think outside of all of the drama, all of the shit that he did post Amir Brockhampton is superior to Amir Brockhampton, so to speak.
Correct take, by the way.
And that's for a number of reasons. One of them is that they don't have a big old piece of shit in the band anymore. That's obvious. Another is like it's unfortunate that it kind of brought out the best in them, that situation. But it did. But I also think there's the hole that you quickly feel is present at the start of the album. By the end, feels like there was no one extra there anyway. I feel like they adapted completely as the album went on. I think like you can almost visualize it. Especially by Tanya, because like where does Amir fit in on Tanya?
Well, the whole thing is like nothing on this album would exist if he were still in the group. That it's defined by his absence in so many different ways. And I think I agree that beyond the initial kind of jarring effect of him not being there anymore, if you consider the chronology, he doesn't really feel missing from the album because. I don't know, maybe it's just because I can't escape having the contextual information, but yeah, he just wouldn't fit on a record like this. But I will say, I'll come to the defense of pre Amir's departure, Brockhampton, and say that my two favorite Brockhampton records are Saturation 3 and Ginger. So one pre Amir's departure and one post it. And I think that well, I guess what that's more representative of is that I kind of like the band most when they're in their most consistent lane. But I think that what's so great about them is that they're so gushing with talent and ability that they're able to capture so many different moods and states of mind depending on where they're at in their lives and make a great record out of it.
Yeah, this album is inescapably tied to a transitional period in my life, and which is why that I'm sure when some people refer to Iridescence as transitional, they mean it in a sort of negative context. But it can never be that to me, because it is just a very rare instance of right place, exact right time for a release for me. But also, I think the album does so much to unify itself, regardless of being a transition from one stage to another, to stand completely as its own thing. And it's a very important step, not just for Brockhampton, but for everyone in Brockhampton. Like, you don't get the story of Don McLennan without Iridescence. You don't get the story of Jobo without Iridescence, you know?
I think like rather than saying the word transitional, it's kind of like this is an album about moving forward. And maybe people expect groups to be in a confident and stable state from one on run release and then on the next release, whether it's the same state or not. But Iridescence, you get a real-time rendition of their processing. And that kind of fits Brockhampton, right? Because all of their music, I would argue, even Saturation, kind of exists in a state of kind of like moving forward and developing in front of you. And that's kind of just what their whole thing is.
Do you make mistakes or do you make a change?
Yeah. And like, so in a sense, you could argue that every Brockhampton record is about moving forward in some way or transitioning in some way from one part of your life to the next or from one state to another.
No, I think that's certainly true. So my first experience with Brockhampton was actually Kevin Abstract's solo record, Arizona Baby, which I talked a little bit about earlier today with Jake. And basically my experience with that record was, it was my first day being second year in university. So this was the first time since basically I was 13 approximately, in which for the first time I had transitioned from being the new person to the old guard, and there were new people. And I sat down where other people had pushed two sofas together. So it was basically a ring with comfy in the middle. And I sat in it and I put on Arizona Baby and I listened to the whole thing and I cried. And it is one of the best experiences with music I've ever had. This sounds nothing like that, I want to say. But what that meant was, going back to this record, I already had all of the historical context, I suppose, which enabled me to sort of understand where the band were coming from, like right off the bat, I suppose. And I also have a lot of, I have a lot of trauma in my life, which I've talked about before. And a lot of how I have in my younger, more vulnerable, more sort of naively foolish moments, I suppose, they show up on this album. It opens with New Orleans, which is a banger. And this is an angry song. The ringing bass and the incredibly high synths that deviate with little little inserts in the background, little samples here and there, just creates this incredibly aggressive, not very melodic, very hard sound, with lines coming from Joba like imminent death is the only sign of life.
Imminent death is the only sign of life.
I'm throwing Hail Marys till I die.
His flow is like I've just come across him in an insane asylum and he is talking gibberish at me, but it's incredibly emotive lyrics. Also calling out people whose approach to trauma is find yourself, love yourself.
Find yourself, love yourself.
Love
Here's
yourself.
the hell, here's the wealth. All together now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an incredibly hard song. And the way it transitions into Thug Life, a very different song, is seamless. In the
fuck.
The
I
drum
love
track,
that part so much.
because the drum track broadly continues uninterrupted, but it's like it's been interrupted by a lounge jazz band, and it's incredible. Berlin, which incidentally, sometimes when I listen to albums that for this podcast, I will just sort of get absent-minded and play my guitar along with it. Found out the song was in E minor by doing that. Don't know if that helps anyone. But anyway, Joba again.
Oh yeah, E minor. Oh yeah.
I don't know. Some people might stand that scale. I don't know.
Okay, I was just making a SpongeBob reference. Don't worry about
I
it.
that's okay. That's okay. No, Joba again here is outstanding. But I really, really, really love something about him. I love that the beat seems to be a preemptor to the song Baby Boy and Arizona Baby. It's got a similar feeling of being sort of almost like warm. It's very short, but it's got a lot in it in terms of texture and tone, and it provides a nice total contrast to the rest of the record, because there is nothing else that is as, I guess, loving as this song on the record. I want to highlight Merlin's opening on Where the Cash At, which is insane, just great. But everything from Thug Life onwards is completely outshined by track 6, Wait, with strings that will break your heart just by themselves. And Kevin rapping lines like I'm not seeing my nieces, I'm the worst in the boy band, rapping about putting the razor blade down. It's incredibly frank about the issues he deals with in many of his
actually bit of trivia, he says in that line, worrying about when Ashlyn finna put the razor down, and Ashlyn is their camera person who apparently struggles with self-harm issues and was very much so at the time.
I didn't know that.
I was going to mention that in my review, but no, I don't have to. Excellent.
But
I'm not a fake fan, I know.
I just want to say he also raps about approaching heteronormative sexuality as a gay man in ways that chime with experiences I've had approaching heteronormativity as an unknowing trans person. And that the way he expresses that experience really struck a very personal connection with me. I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to. It's very personal, but that's there. And when the drum and bass beat comes in, it's heavy and loud, but it only makes the vulnerable emotions more strong and at the front of the record. Because basically all the drums do is it takes the emotions and texture in the rest of the record and makes it sort of louder and more aggressive. And I love the refrain that comes in of what pressure does to Joba.
Oh, that's my favorite part of the song, is that bridge. God, the tone of his voice when he delivers that is just like, I get chills.
Yeah.
God, it's so good.
Yeah, District is maybe the most structurally ambitious song on the record. Starting out very string-led, getting much heavier, leading into almost harsh noise and IDM at points, but going into melancholy guitar by the end, and a 3-part structure that I find very interesting. Again, Joba coming in with, great God, hallelujah, I'm still depressed.
At war with my conscience, paranoid, can't find that shit.
Praise God, hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Still depressed. I say that like daily.
The way he says it with such irony and sincerity at the same time, like he is completely detached from the world, but in touch with his own emotions, and is approaching his anger at the world with that with that framework. It really strikes me in a very relatable way. you've all talked about Tape beautifully. It has an interpolation of Radiohead's Videotape as the piano chords on it, and I'm going to be honest, has a very similar emotional impact to me.
Yeah.
To that song.
It's not even just the piano chords; it's the actual beat of the song itself. Is the skittering beat that kind of ripples across the mix is taken directly from the latter half of that song, and obviously the title itself is probably a reference to that.
Sure. Jouvert is my second favorite song on the record, and it goes the beat switch in the middle of it, leading into Merlin's verse, initially threw me, but in the context of the record, it makes a lot more sense, because the appeal of this record is this shifting sort of chimera-esque emotional tapestry where each song has multiple stages. The whole album shifts between different tones and approaches very quickly. So the way it goes from Joba's hardcore hip hop to Merlin's much more almost like Spanish influenced electronica is it feels much more in keeping when you listen to it in the context of the record. But I've always loved this song, irrespective of that.
Shout out to, there's a lot of what happens on the song that's not Joba gets overlooked, but I want to shout out Matt's line, neck twist like Exorcist, I'm a see you round.
Exorcist.
Yeah. I'm a see you round, which is a lovely bit of wordplay.
No, absolutely. And also I love the way that his voice is treated broadly across the record. Matt Champion. Yeah. Especially like the start of this, his verse at the start of this record, and also his verse at the start of San Marcos. Two very different songs. They're treated in post-production in very similar ways of layering on the vocals, of making it seeming almost synthetic and computer-esque in a way that only adds the alienation and the emotional sincerity that this album brings, which is a very tightrope to walk. But no, there is a verse on here that goes, misunderstood since birth, fuck what you think, fuck what you heard. I feel betrayed. You can keep the praise. Anyway, sorry. But no, misunderstood since birth. Fuck what you think. Fuck what you heard. The delivery is so aggressive that it hits you viscerally anyway. But you can't not be a confused young person and not feel seen by the song. And also probably because this is the first major label record that's verses about that seem to metaphorically talk about selling out on this record as well. And Merlin's verses, of course, about sort of seeking simplicity whilst being a person in the world. And he approaches that in myriad complex ways to do with racial identity and to do with how you were stereotyped by others often. And it's really good like that. Honey, a really good song. I love the pulsating synth beat on this that substitutes for a bass. Dom's flow it slaps me in the face. There's, like other songs on the record, a dope guitar outro. And I want to take a moment to talk about San Marcos, because when I listened to the song, it was all I could do but stop to write down lines that hit me in a particular place, such as is you drinking for the pain, is you drinking for fun, say it with your chest, pray to work again. Is you dancing all alone, is you drinking for someone. And then Joba coming in saying suicidal thoughts, but I won't do it, take it how you want, it's important, I admit it. I know that I'm selfish, do my best to be selfless, I know that I'm changing. And it was at that point I'd only gotten the first I know down on paper, and the choir coming in saying I want more out of life than this came in, and I had to stop writing and pause the song and just cry.
Yeah.
And that was about half an hour before we recorded. This is for me in my top 5 Brockhampton songs, maybe top 3. And the way it blends acoustic guitars, choirs, and sort of electric interludes with occasional vocal overplays. It sounds like almost no other hip-hop song I've ever heard. And the emotional frankness emotions on the sleeveness of it, which Brockhampton have made their trademark, hits me in a very particular way, especially when it's like a rap band sort of trying to be Sufjan Stevens, if you get me.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a combination that will melt me, and just it's a transcendent outro when the strings come in to mimic the melody of them saying, I want more out of life than this. I want more. And it's that reaching up to the top for that emotional crescendo that just hits me right in the gut. I am, in fact, at the moment struggling not to cry, so I'll move on to Tonya. That'll help.
Yeah, that'll do.
It may surprise you to know that it was only today that I got the broad appeal of this song, because the lyrics I'd never been able to quite make out the lyrics before, but today I heard them loud and clear, and it destroyed me. Dom's verse especially, bare faces, sliding melodies, and sort of very quiet vocals help, and the piano flows. They talk about their lives being comparable to the film I, Tonya, which really narrowed home how recent this album is. This is an incredible song. Oh dear. And yet Fabric is a beautiful closer. After all that, how do I summarize this record? Because it is so expansive, so complicated, so widgety and bitty and all over the place, but in a way I love. Yeah, I can't say it's not a mess, but in being a mess, it covers so much ground in 45 minutes while still seeming like it's from the same voices. It is, the fact is, trauma is messy, and this album captures trauma beautifully. So of course it's messy. What did
if it wasn't messy, it wouldn't be what it is.
What did you expect them to do? Like, you were never going to get another Saturation album. And the fact is, Tyler said something in the Discord that I really agree with, which is that really there's a lot of this that's a large continuation from the trajectory between Sat 1 and Sat 3, in terms of it explores texture in a way that was always increasing, and using that texture to show intricate emotional nuances. And they really stripped back songs on Sat 3 that were bangers without that textural exploration to just sit in the emotions they're feeling. And I've said recently that for me, music is about looking yourself square in the eye and having to reckon with what you see. And that's what this album is on every track. And I can't think of one that doesn't do that in a very, very, very effective way.
Yeah.
It is my favorite Brockhampton record, as much as I love Ginger. But yeah, I love it.
Okay, so I think that although I obviously love this album, and I've been vocal about how much I love it, I think it's still August and I don't actually know how August feels, but I imagine the two of us are going to be as close of a counterpoint to the other three as possible, because I mean, we're the only two here for whom this isn't, well, actually no, I can't say that about August because it's the only one he's heard, but like, it's not my favorite Brockhampton record, I'll say that much, but I do think it's a really good album. And I kind of have already kind of given a lot of my thoughts, but I will kind of dig into it a little bit more and hopefully kind of try and interrogate what it is about the mess of this record that works, and the few parts of it that I think don't work. I think it opens how you open a record is so important as to like the impression that people get of a record, obviously. But I mean, it's easy to underestimate for us who are such album people, how many people will try out an album just by putting on the first song and will likely not listen to the whole thing. I think this was something that Saoirse actually talked about in a recent episode as well. Actually, no, it was something Saoirse talked about in the interview I did with her, where it's like you have to get someone with the opening of a record or else they're just going to turn it off. or more to the point, that the impression you give with the way your record opens will define how people think of it to a large extent. And so if you compare a track like New Orleans as an opener to the opener of the record that precedes it, Boogie, I think just comparing those two tracks gives you a really strong sense of what the aim is with Iridescence and the way in which it differs from the Saturation trilogy, even as it also serves as a continuation of it. Because Boogie is this incredibly busy track where there's so much happening. It's chaotic. There's these sirens going off. It's wild. It's energetic. And New Orleans has a similar kind of sense of energy and propulsion, but it's much more sparse in comparison. And where Boogie is gloriously melodic and full of all these kind of whizzing and whirling and beautiful textures, New Orleans is a dissonant and ugly song. It is really kind of confronting and jarring. I as someone who got into Brockhampton when Saturation 1 came out and followed the train, I remember my first experience of this record so much more vividly, no pun intended, than the other records that they've made, just because it was such a jarring experience from front to back. But New Orleans in particular is like, whoa, okay, this is what? I do think that the sparseness of the track, though intentional, is part of what holds it back from being a really top tier Brockhampton song. It is still very good. I think Dom, Joba, and Merlin in particular really find the right energy for the verses to match how deranged the beat is. And I do think that that is to the extent that the other voices on the track maybe don't stand out as much as those three. In particular, the transition into Thug Life is obviously great. I love the way that the vocal effects on the singing and rapping here clash against the crispness of the piano sample. It's very nice and very Brockhampton. And this, I think, is a great point for me to bring up, the way that vocal effects are used on this record. Obviously, vocal effects and auto-tune and all these kinds of different ways of making various members of the group sound different is as a key part of their music, has been throughout the Saturation trilogy. But I think it's really turned to 11 on this album, to the point where you get the performers on this album often sounding alien, bizarre, sometimes even unpleasant to listen to, just purely in terms of the effects put on the voices. And that's clearly a part, I think, of inducing this state of fractured identity on this record that represents the fractured identity of the band's current state and making it. It's a beautiful mirror of that in terms of production detail. And that sense of fracturing, and in so many of the different elements of this record, is what I think is the genius of it, in terms of the way that it serves as a commentary on so many of the things that have happened to them that they don't actually need to explicitly rap about on the record. Like, obviously there's plenty of rapping on this record about industry related stuff, Brockhampton's image in the media, how they've reckoned with their fame. And I do think that, to be frank, some of the stuff about like reckoning with industry and image on tracks like Fabric, for instance, are maybe the least compelling subject matter on the record, just because I think that the more personal stuff on this record really shines the most. And I like, as I said, I like the way that the turmoil is more reflected in the way the record sounds than in some of the explicit lyrical subject matter. But that's a really minor quibble. I want to shout out, as it's already been shouted out by Morgan, but I think Dom's verse on Thug Life is super underrated. I think it's one of my favorite verses on the whole record, actually. It's really great, to the point where revisiting this, I had actually kind of forgotten that Dom even has a verse on this track. And then I remembered as I revisited, I was like, fuck, this song is so much better than I ever gave it credit for.
And it is a bit pitch shifted, to be fair. It doesn't really sound like him so much as he does in other spots. So definitely.
And I think that pitch shifted vocal quality and alienating sounds Again, it's really thrown at you from the beginning of this album, and it's ratcheted up even more on Berlin, which is one of the most fucked up tracks on the record. It takes the bouncing, delayed, distorted percussion sounds of New Orleans and it blows them up. The track is just coated in these boom, boom sounds that are just kind of like almost, well, definitely unpleasant, but almost overwhelming the rest of the song. But the track is saved by the fact that there's so much great going on in terms of the performances on this track. Just so much range from proper rapping to some of the more sing style stuff that BFAce and Joba do, and it's just so good. A really strong track. Yeah, you have also the rest of this track. I would also point out as well, despite the fact that this is in many ways one of the most jarring songs, this is in many ways also one of the songs that bears the most similarity to some of the saturation stuff, because you get these wheezing synthetic organy tones in the background of the song that are all over the Saturation trilogy, and it kind of links in musically there as well. So in many ways, I come away from this feeling as though the ugliness of it is like the natural next step of the abrasion of Saturation 3, for example. And that abrasion on that record and the way it's contained and precise, and then just kind of erupting on songs like Sister Nation is one of my favorite things they've ever done. And I like the way that it's built on here in songs like this anyway. And I will say that I think the inclusion, I know this is not a hot take and it's an opinion that was voiced quite a lot when the record came out, but the inclusion of Something About Him and Where the Cash At to a certain extent does really halt the album in a way that doesn't quite work for me. And it's not that I think that these songs are particularly weak. I think that, for example, Something About Him would fit in on, it's kind of like a little bit more of a distorted and ugly version of something that would fit on American Boyfriend, for instance. And I think it's fine, but it feels out of place here. And Where the Cash At is, I don't like talking shit on Where the Cash At because it's Merlin at his most Merlin, and it's so fucking entertaining.
Merlin.
It's just ridiculously entertaining. I do feel though that it just is maybe it's just in a weird place on the record. But you do get these jarring shifts on the record and moments like from Where the Cash At into Wait is a really prime example. And then another one is, I think, Vivid into San Marcos as well. It's like a moment of just like whiplash almost of how different these two songs are. And it's definitely an intentional way of summing up the messiness of the record, but it's also, on the same side of the coin, something that sometimes takes me out of the cohesive record experience. And it's where I come into a point where it's like sometimes the messiness of Iridescence is, as has already been said, so core to what works about it. But it can also be an aspect that sometimes sours the full record experience as well. It's kind of weird how sometimes it really clicks for me, and then other times it really feels a bit, I don't know. It's weird. Like I kind of want this record to be like half an hour longer. Like I almost in a weird way. I don't know why.
Wouldn't argue with it.
I just feel like it's like, yeah, it could have been so much more sprawling in a way that probably would have made it worse, but would have made it feel even more iridescency. I don't know. Anyway, forget about that because Wait, I don't need to hammer on about Wait because I already kind of talked about it earlier. It's an amazing song. It moves from one gorgeous section to the next with every single performer absolutely crushing it. And as I've already mentioned, I particularly love Joba's bridge on this track, where the effects on his voice make him sound like he's genuinely on the verge of a breakdown. But I think it has to be said that though I think Kevin is not the most commanding presence in Brockhampton, he absolutely owns this song. And it cannot be denied that it's his finest moment on the record. And I think to a certain extent, despite being the front man of the band, Kevin has kind of become a little underrated in his own band, strangely enough.
I mean, he says it himself. I feel like I'm the worst in the boy band.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, but that's I think they would also write that bar at some point, just because of the way that they are.
Yeah.
But
I think it's more like when people talk about Dark Side of the Moon these days, where it's like it's kind of a foregone conclusion,
yeah.
and it's kind of looped back around to being like people are not really giving this enough credit.
But I think that's what made Ginger so satisfying as well, is that I think that Kevin, I mean, I've heard that some people don't like what Kevin does on Ginger, but I think that he is more compelling generally on that record than he is here. That
Have these people considered stopping?
Yeah. But Wait is a gigantic exception, and Wait is fantastic, and it's a great example of how I think so many of the members of the group get real moments to shine on this record in a way that makes it feel super, like maybe obviously not the best introduction to the group, I would say, but certainly like something that reminds you of their distinct and unique talents following the fallout of Amir leaving the group, and reminds you that there's still so much this band has to give. And yeah, fantastic. District is one of my favorite songs on the record. I love the beat. It's another example of a really unhinged and just kind of distorted and ugly beat. I want to shout out the fact that the beat on this track is so similar to the beat on MIA's song Tequila from her third album Maya, to the point that I've no doubt that was a point of influence on this record. That's a similarly kind of incredibly messy and ugly sounding album, where an artist takes a public perception of their image and completely seizes it and vomits it back at the audience in a way that I think Iridescence maybe doesn't do it in the same way, but I think there's a spiritual relationship between those two records, and I think the beat on District links them together in a very direct way. Seriously, it's very similar to the beat on that song, and that is only a compliment. But yeah, great song otherwise as well. Again, everyone gets a moment to shine on this track. I just love it to bits. Tape, another one of my favorite songs on the record. Obviously already touched on the skittering beat that samples or at least references Radiohead, but I also want to shout out the fact that towards the end of this track, you have a fucking breakcore section, which is like Venetian snares type breakcore just happens in this song. And it's like, it takes the kind of drum and bass part of Wait and kind of flips it into this, breakcore madness. And I think it's such a cool inclusion. And it's really amazing how well the band fit on this sound that I would never have associated with them. So in many ways, I think Tape is one of the most impressive songs on the record for just completely upending my expectation of what Brockhampton are and what they're musically capable of. And of course, it leads right into the sensational Juvere, which has been talked about so much. I've already kind of mentioned the way that I feel the bass on this track is sickening, fuzzed, distorted. It unsettles you. I do think, though, that if the track has any issue, it might just be in its own internal structure, and that I think that Joba's verse is such heat that the song itself kind of never really recovers from it, and it kind of overshadows everything that comes after it in the song. And I kind of just wish that it were saved for the last verse of the song rather than coming in the second place. But that's a minor quibble again. It's still a great song regardless, and frankly, brilliant choice for a lead single as well in terms of letting people know, because I think the only real things you had before this album came out were this and the live performance of Tonya, which is two completely different things that I can imagine. I don't have to imagine, I can remember having no idea what to expect from Iridescence on the basis of that. Anyway, I do have to lapse into a little bit of minor criticism again in saying that I do think that the record isn't quite as great from this point onwards, with one major exception. It's not so much that the songs aren't great. because each song has great moments. Many songs have multiple, but I do think, generally speaking, that some of the weaker stuff does happen towards this final stretch of the record. I don't particularly love Honey. I like actually no, that's not true. I like the verse. I like Dom's verse on Honey, which I think is great. His verse is actually inspired by Aesop Rock's classic flow on his track None Shall Pass, which Dom has talked about his love of Aesop Rock. And I think I love he kind of takes on an almost sort of Caribbean inflection in his delivery on this voice, in his delivery on this verse, and I love it. I just think the hook on this track is kind of weak, to be frank, and I just don't particularly care for it. Then you get Vivid, which
care for you.
Yeah, fair enough. Go for it. Eat me. The
I
Vivid.
think I might.
I love the way Vivid again is another track. Vivid again is another track that I don't think kind of comes together as a whole song, but has a great parts. Again, Dom steals it. I love the way he switches his delivery from like 1 to 100, like abruptly in the middle of his verse in this track.
One of my favorite Brockhampton isms is when they will. Merlin does it too on a couple records, is where one of their deliveries will like fade out and segue into a delivery that is theirs, but also completely fucking different. And it's just like, it is such a massive fucking flex of them to be like, this is me and this is me. Fuck you. It's just like.
Joba does that a lot, I think, especially on like Saturation records, where he'll like just completely flip his vocal tone on a dime. And and the fact that multiple members of the group are capable of that. I mean, Bareface also he's proved more and more in the recent stuff. It's just, again, these guys are overflowing with talent. But yeah, I wish Vivid were a great song as a whole, but I do enjoy lots of elements about it. I do think, though, that the song is a great demonstration of the record's most chaotic musical aspects. You have fried and bizarre vocal effects. You have chopped up samples. You have an almost oppressive beat. But yeah, I just wish it were a little more work had been done on it. And then you kind of, as I mentioned, you get this kind of jarring shift into San Marcos, which is basically the polar opposite of that track in some respects. The effect here is like you're underground and then suddenly you're emerging into blinding city lights. The guitar tone on San Marcos is like so incandescent, it almost fries my brain, and it's beautiful. I think it is one of the most beautiful tracks the band have ever released. But I'm gonna maybe voice my most unpopular opinion on this podcast ever, and say that I don't really care for the gospel choir outro too much.
Obviously what I'm about to say to you is not literal, but you have spit on Cliff Burton's grave.
you see Jeremy's back. He hasn't been here for a bit. He came because he's sad about what you said.
I'm so sorry.
He looks pretty happy about it.
Oh, he came? Well, I guess he's happy.
Yeah, look,
that's just fucking nasty.
Look, I think the song is really good. I love every verse on this song, particularly Joba's verse on this song. I think is great. Just let me bring it up for a second. It's just so much. It's really straightforward, like not dressed up in too much metaphor or anything, but and it's delivered in a really kind of straightforward, and he's almost singing it, and I don't know, it just really kind of makes me well up. Suicidal thoughts, but I won't do it. Take that how you want. It's important, I admit it. Like, what a couplet to open your verse. And very, I'm already kind of fuck.
Yeah.
Right, that's the problem.
I'm afraid of commitment. I don't know how to fix it. Maybe codependent. I can't tell the difference. When push comes to shove, I'd rather bend than break, but something's got to give. Ain't that what they say? When you're torn between reality and a choice you could have made or should have made, they're not the same. I'm not the same. I will stop there because I'm 110. I'm 110% certain that Jake's going to talk about that some more anyway. So but that's one of my favorite moments on the record is just Joba's real straightforwardness there. It's not he's already had moments on this record where he gets to be more dramatic and scream at you, and really, so the plain spokenness of that verse really guts me in a particular way. But yeah, I do think that the gospel choir is certainly a creative touch. Like, it's definitely a product of working in Abbey Road and being inspired by that whole atmosphere. And but I do think that it clashes weirdly.
I'm not picking on what you're saying. It's just that I think you unintentionally literally said that's a choice.
No, I said it's a creative choice, like a really creative choice. Like, it's definitely a product of being in a place like Abbey Road, and yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Like, it is. I am basically saying it's a choice. I do think it clashes weirdly with the percussion that's underlying it, especially when it comes in. And I just think it feels a little bit too like this is a band that are able to capture grand, sweeping emotions effortlessly, but this is a moment that feels like they're kind of trying too hard to be grandiose, and it just feels kind of a bit shoehorned. And I appreciate the extent to which it's incredibly important and affecting for other people here, so I'm going to leave it at that. But it's yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to make like a scowling face and I couldn't fucking do it.
I just want a gif of Morgan making that face.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But look, I'll move on because Tanya is the best fucking track they've ever made.
Okay, I was so worried. When you were just like, when you were about to talk shit, I was just like, if this motherfucker is about to spit some nonsense about Tanya, I'm gonna fucking whoop his Kiwi ass.
I was not afraid to be honest about San Marcos because I knew that I would be able to be honest in a different way about Tanya and say that it is the best song they've ever made. And I've always kind of, it's really hard for me to pick my favorite Brockhampton song. Obviously, I'm a fan. Mm-hmm. There's so many great picks. But on the last few re-listens to prep for this, it was really clear to me just how fantastic Tanya is. Particularly, the musical arrangement is just astounding on this track. And the way that it blossoms. Again, there's a sense of grandiosity and kind of, sweepingness to it that's also there on a track like San Marcos, but it feels much more organic here. I think in many respects, it's the most defining song on the record. And yeah, it just, everyone turns in some of their best parts on the whole album. Dom's verse, as usual, is absolutely incredible. And I particularly love the way that the dramatic piano flourishes, get really kind of, dramatic as he's rapping. And the hook is delivered by Serpent with Feet, I think, and is really great. And just the vocal intonation and deliveries here are just so emotional. But I particularly want to shout out the MVP of the track, which is Merlin. My favorite part of this song, and I think he delivers the most definitive line of the whole album, which is "Don't think too fast, private jets still crash." Obviously, the way he sings it, it rhymes. But yeah, that's a great line, and I think it encapsulates the whole ethos of Iridescence, of being at a juncture where you're going through so much shit, and you're also being thrust into the spotlight and having all these expectations thrown upon you. But you have to be aware of the fact that because you're now beloved, you can't just coast. You need to be conscious of that. And in many ways, Iridescence is a document of a band that are hyper-conscious of the way that they're perceived and are trying to reconcile wanting to please their audience with their absolutely irrefutable desire to do what they want. And that kind of clash between audience expectations and a relentless creative drive, particularly when you have so many different unique creative voices on a record like this, is at the heart of the Brockhampton narrative. The Brockhampton post-saturation narrative anyway. But what a great fucking bar in and of itself, and the way that it's significant to the band. But yeah, an astounding song. It has been ever since they first performed it on Jimmy Fallon. And yeah, just I can't imagine having a bad word to say about it, to be honest. It's just gorgeous. And perhaps it stands out in a way as being like particularly beautiful on a record that is otherwise so musically ugly. But it almost feels like, especially at the point that it comes in the record, it's a necessary sort of reprieve. And it's just, yeah, so good. Fabric is a curious closer. It feels weirdly anticlimactic. I think Kevin and Dom are rapping about the struggles that the band have had with their perception in media, their place in the industry, obviously a theme that's relevant throughout the record. But I do think that this track feels, again, no pun intended, strangely weightless and, again, anticlimactic. I wonder if that's intentional, though, because you get, at the very end of this track, you get the best years of our lives teaser tag hidden at the end of the song. And I genuinely believe that they were intending to release a record that ties into that ethos again quite quickly after Iridescence that didn't emerge. It could be that Ginger is the second part of this trilogy, but I honestly find it that hard to believe because that record to me is just so much of a pivot from everything that came before it that it feels so much like it's entirely new universe. But yeah, Fabric's certainly not a bad track, but it does feel like a curiously, anticlimactic end to the record. And maybe though it's just fitting. I don't know. Because like I said, Iridescence is this record that captures this permanent state of moving forward, whether you want to use the word transitional to describe that or not. And so maybe it is fitting that it ends in a way that doesn't feel definitive, but feels like a comma rather than a full stop. It's a dour note to end the record on for sure, especially with a hook like "You don't understand why I can't get up and shout." But maybe it's an appropriate one considering how intentionally ramshackle and introspective the record is. And again, this is just totally maybe the quintessential 2010s anyway document of a band that are suddenly rocketed to success and then get given essentially a blank check to make the big album. And Iridescence is a curious example and has all the hallmarks of the sophomore record. It says a lot that it can be viewed as both a sophomore slump and as the band's most pivotal statement in the same breath, I think. It is an album that contains multitudes. And I've always loved it, or at least liked it a lot, if not loved, but it is a record that I almost feel slightly different about each time I listen to it because it's this record that exists so much in this state of limbo. But I think that's all part of what makes it the most fascinating Brockhampton record to talk about so far, and I think a really great choice for a record club. It has everything that makes the band so great, has a compelling narrative, and it is debatable in so many different ways. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I'm very curious to hear where August falls on it, particularly, because getting to come at it from the perspective of not having all this additional context and experience with saturation, and just getting to listen to this as a thing in and of itself.
Okay, so figure I'll take it away from there. So not having really any context going into this was quite interesting. That being said, I've always had friends who were into Brockhampton. I just never really got aboard the train myself during those during that time in which they were like really exploding, but I had kind of followed the narrative roughly enough through knowing Jake at that time and being exposed to some of that stuff, which if you want a perfect illustration of just how much he's into these guys, that might help you. That before we even did this stuff, he was into this. Anyways, so the opening track, I didn't write down what it was called.
New Orleans.
Nolans left me a bit perplexed, to say the least. Not in a necessarily bad way, not in a necessarily good way, but perplexed, because it gave me an impression that is very different from what the album is, what it is as a whole, because it's this track where you've got essential, I think all 6, not like most of the main MCs each delivering a verse on this track and then just dipping out, and it left me with some weird expectations for what the rest of the record was going to be like, because I was like, I thought the chemistry here is a little weird, it's a little wonky, I'm not quite sure this all comes together for me. And that was the first track, and thankfully as this went on, I feel it both comes together in a really interesting, satisfying way, and also does not, with the very messy nature of the record, which I will kind of get into. And I thought that once you get past that first track, I think that's where the record starts to light up, and you really get a sense of the talents of every individual member. You really can. I mean, you guys could describe their personalities much better than me, having lived with the 5 records the group have put out for at least for like a year at minimum, and like 5 years at most, 4 years, I don't know, can't do math on the fly, but so it does make that aspect of it a bit harder on a first listen to really kind of or like second listen to really kind of get into the who's who and really understand where this is all coming from narratively, like what each personality is about. But I found with listening to it that everyone is a very distinct MC. There's never a point where it's for me like, oh yeah, this could have just been delivered by any one of the 6. It's like everyone does a good job at kind of doing their own thing. And I think the record really gets good when it kind of just pulls back and lets the individual members do their own thing with the assistance of like one other person on a track. I thought that was a really good way to develop the particular chemistry of the MCs on this record. And I thought the pitch shifted vocals speak to a really interesting way those have developed in hip hop, where like you could listen to something that came out a couple years or like even a year or 2 prior to this, and that stuff could sound tacky, really tacky. And I think here, all of the pitch shifting sounds quite good. It never feels like so corny and goofy, but it still delivers this nice kind of alien sense to it, as Tyler made a point of. I think tracks like Berlin and Something About Him demonstrate this really well. And I think this same kind of narrative of pitch shifted vocals just getting better and better is furthered in the record Igor by Tyler, the Creator, which is like the picture perfect example of how to do that.
Brockhampton share a lot of DNA with Odd Future as a collective. I mean, to varying degrees of artistic success, granted, but still.
Yeah, no, I thought that was quite interesting to see. One of the most admirable qualities, I thought, is that they have a lot of versatility in what they present. You can get like just you can get just these massive banger tracks, and also these more subtle, more low-key emotional bits. I really I enjoyed that versatility. It really does make something like that Slow Tie record we reviewed earlier seem infantile in comparison with how this is able to just they're just able to do both of these, and it's both of these kind of extremes of hip hop, and it sounds like all very uniform production wise, very uniform in terms of just the presentation. I think it's good. That being yeah, that's how you get a transition like Where the Cash At to Wait. And I think that does lead to the kind of structural fracture, the messiness, as it were, of this record, which I will say, contrary to most everyone else here, did not work for me particularly well. I will give credence to the points of like, oh yeah, it's meant to be messy because mental health is a very messy thing, and I wouldn't deny that. I just think that the way that is conveyed on this record, like it even, you can say it's meant to be messy, but at the end of the day, it's still messy, and that's not particularly an appealing quality in my mind.
Well, it's like how I was trying to reconcile with aspects of the record's messiness that I like versus aspects of its messiness that I don't like. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that messiness is not an inherently good or bad quality, I don't think.
No.
It's just like, it just has to do with context, I think. And there are some points in the record where it feels like part of this greater thing. And there are other points where it feels like it could have just been finessed a bit better to have have the same intended effect.
No, I think that's a very fair point. I will say, I think and I think that messiness it's at its like worst within the first half of this record. And I think the second half is where a lot of this really coalesces and becomes a really nice whole. Like, I really love the emotional beats on here. Like tracks like Wait and Tanya serve as these like noticeable highlights, as these just really gorgeous meditations on mental health and what's troubling the members. And I think, and I could sit here and spit lyrics back at you, but I figure everyone else has done that, so I won't. And the string arrangements, I thought, worked decently well. It was not something I would have expected going into this to work in the way it does, and it kind of does. Yeah. So
the strings on Wait are so good that they got to loophole, and they're just like, fucking play that shit back.
Yeah, that's a particularly interesting, good moment on there. And yeah, I think that in the second half is like just all consistently good to great songs. I think this is where the record takes a much more focused turn, and we get like some really gnarly production here. Like Tanya has this really nice beat, very beautifully vulnerable song too. The closer Fabric, I think, is really awesome. And I love the way that song just builds and builds its intensity as it goes along, climaxing in the choral parts just getting louder and louder and grander and grander. I thought that was all very interesting. Now, the thing is, and what you've all kind of made the point for me without realizing it, is the whole emotional connection aspect of this record, because there are certainly parts where it feels a bit hard to approach, not having the context of like just loving and getting into the saturation albums, because there are very clearly moments on here that are just that almost like a lot of the interpolations of older songs of theirs were things that would have completely just gone over my head had Genius not existed. And it almost makes me think, wow, that would be really, I might really get a lot out of that reprise of that particular lyrical idea had I had that context. And it's almost something where I feel my review of this is incomplete because I don't have that context. And I mean, granted, it's not something I can do in just like 1 week's time, just sit through all like 2 hours of the Saturation trilogy, get really engrossed in that, and then move on to this. I feel there, yeah, I just feel the personal connection is so strong that it can kind of leave me at a distance. But at the same time, I have to say there's something admirable about that I can think that they've clearly formed such a strong connection with so many people. This record almost feels intended solely for those people. But yeah, so it kind of feels like how Jake was talking about Cardiacs last week, where there are just things I want to say about this, but I just feel I can't because I'm not approaching this from the best point of view, perhaps. And that was a lot of rambling to make one point, but yeah, that's about what I have to say.
Understandable. Have a nice day.
Very well put. And I think, as I've already said, I think it's valuable to have the perspective of someone who's not coming at this record from having heard Saturation, because then that allows you to actually evaluate it as a standalone thing. Because we've talked about it so much in terms of context, and that ignores the fact that, you know, a record should stand on its own, regardless of that. And
yeah, and I don't know. For me, it just doesn't stand alone terribly well. But obviously, that's not an experience any of you can agree with, because you've just never had that point of view and never will. Hopefully, because I wouldn't want you to get Alzheimer's or something.
I was going to say, that would be some very sudden brain damage.
Yeah, no.
I'll tell you what, there's more than a few records that I would love to just like create some memory loss just to experience for the first time again.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd put any Brockhampton records on that, because I value having followed this band in their journey so much.
Yeah. I just tie back right to the very beginning of this weekend's recording. That was what it was like re-listening to Confield this week, was like for the first time again.
Yeah, this is the Confield of Brockhampton. Just fucking put a gun in my mouth and end my life.
I won't argue. No. Right.
Well, I suppose that puts the proverbial weight on my shoulders.
Wait.
There's it really kind of sucks when you think about it, just because it's like, this is such a good idea. Like, as said, not to toot my own horn or anything, it's not like I did this because it was an intellectual decision. It was obvious, and nothing I make is an intellectual decision. I'm an emotional creature. But as Tyler said, this is a great pick for a record club, obviously, because there's a lot of different places you can come at this from. And first of all, I feel like this discussion has yielded so much cultivation of just the actual core content of this album in like the best way possible. August's perspective, Tyler's perspective, Morgan's and Saoirse's perspective. I feel like we've gotten the entire breadth of what I feel like should be covered with this album. So, precarious in my position now, because if I want to say anything, I have to say anything that things that haven't been said before, which I can't entirely do because, I obviously feel a lot of similar ways to the way everyone has spoken and to some degree or another. And there's also the expectation of just like, this is a top 5 record for me. This is my favorite hip hop album. I love this album in a way that honestly, I don't even really love any album ever. It's strange and it's emblematic. And I think August gets to the point of it perfectly in the sense that like it all depends on context. And it shows you that art is not this thing that just exists in this objective state. The very idea of naming this album Iridescence, which is basically how light can refract off of an object differently based on the perspective that you view it on. That in and of itself is what this record is. It is looking at everything in a new light. It's the band looking at themselves in a new light. It's the listeners looking at the band looking at themselves in a new light. It's a microscope, but it's also a kaleidoscope. And it also just like that context, for better or for worse, can make or break anything, not just this album, can make or break any piece of art. And it's a testament to the quality of that context to say that the context, whether or not I have it, I feel this way now, just as August feels that way. Like, and this is our opinion and it's different, and that's what makes it special. And there's also the inherent expectation from each perform here, because I've made it a bit of a habit of mine of disclosing incredibly personal life information with records that are very important to me, especially records that are quite melancholic. And as Tyler kind of hinted out, I guess my attempt here will be to end it anticlimactically, in that I'm not going to tell a sad story. I will talk about the record just in a little few scattershot things just to fill in the gaps a little bit. I don't know if anybody knew this or just didn't mention it, but the chaoticism of the opening track New Orleans is definitely epitomized by the fact that Jaden Smith is on here.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot to mention.
Did you not know that?
Yeah, he's on there at the very.
Yeah, he delivers the last refrain. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I was wondering who that was.
Yeah, that's Jaden Smith.
It's
him and Kevin are friends. So that take with that knowledge what you will. It also explains why his worst project was him trying to be Brockhampton. But I think that the sort of mission statement for the album is just sort of right out of the gate. If I could describe what the production is on this album, which is messy and chaotic and all those other things, it consists of 2 really prominent instrumental presences. One of them is synths that I would only describe as feverish. When Tyler talked about the album kind of making him feel like it was like sick or like ill, that's perfect. It's feverish. It's something is wrong with it. It's sour. It's strange. And it contrasts with the incredibly lavish, beautiful strings, which these 2 things instrumentally are like diametrically opposed. Like, it's one of the most organic sounding things, like the lushness of the strings is just so like prominent, and you have something so sickly as the synths, and the organicness and the artificialness just sort of clashes. And I do want to say that the fact that they've had access to a studio, like the fact that this is their first RCA record, this album sounds expensive. Like, it sounds great. No matter how messy it gets, all of the ideas sonically are beautifully realized. There isn't a moment of this where like it might be chaotic and you might not like that about it, but it's always sounds that are happening in exactly the right way that they need to. And as mentioned, the transition from New Orleans into Thug Life is fucking incredible. The drum beat just sort of continues, and the piano that's later we see on songs like Tanya comes in, and Thug Life is just an incredible track. And we've been talking about how, just kind of collectively, how great Dom's verse is. And not to be too much of a basic bitch with trying to relay how good things are, but I am going to take a look at this verse because frankly, it is underappreciated, as Tyler said, so much so that it needs to be pointed out to people. And in fact, I also view it sort of as a companion / expansion sequel to my favorite Brockhampton verse and my favorite verse ever, which is his verse in Milk, where he directly references skeletons in his closet. It is a complete thematic and narrative progression of that exact moment.
Fuck, you're right.
Yeah, it's different reconciling with skeletons I ain't know I possessed, which that's the most inherently connected line. I sought perfection out in ways that I no longer accept. I understand what I neglect in times when I obsess. I'm learning to confess. This fate is harder to digest. Also, the fucking rhyme scheme. Oh my fucking God, Dom. The biggest threat I'm up against is who I face in my reflection. Depression's still an uninvited guest I'm always accepting. Can't help but meet the feeling with a familiar embrace when I know that it'll kill me if I give in to my brain. I see the shadows inside, 10 feet tall with no eyes. They put my head in the water and it's so beautiful under. The sun reflecting off the corals, colors I can't describe, to make the darkness divine. That final line is Iridescence, to make the darkness divine. And it's beautiful. And then we seamlessly get basically the moment that I think makes or breaks this album for people can be easily gauged by the next song, Berlin. And it's basically like you have the soft tranquility of a song like Thug Life, and then the immediate whiplash into Berlin, which is just, there's a fucking engine of a car being revved sampled in it. It sounds fucking wild, and it's just them going absolutely crazy with hook upon hook upon hook. I love the wordplay, where they talk about there's sort of an allusion to the colors on their neck, which is sort of like talking about gang affiliations. But they also talk about how the chains on their neck will turn their neck green, which is an actual thing with fake gold that leaves a green like dye on your skin if you wear it. So it's like basically it's come to be known as like a symbol in hip hop of like, you know, like fakeness, of artificiality.
Yeah, that would be because of like oxidization of cheap metals that rust easily.
Yes, exactly. So they talk about that, like the colors on their neck having a great double meaning here. But they go fucking hard. This song is just so enjoyable, and I love the baby boy, why you looking grimy as shit refrain. Just fucking amazing. Dom, as always, going incredibly fucking hard. He talks about did some Beatles shit to kick off this September, referencing the fact that they're recording in Abbey Road. There's a moment on Merlin's verse in Where the Cash At, where he says, if Jesus was a pop star, would he break the bank? Which is an obvious allusion to John Lennon, member of the Beatles, saying Beatles are bigger than Jesus. And at the time,
they recorded this at Abbey Road.
That is what I just said.
I'm dumb. Forgive me.
And they say that, and it's just this perfect encapsulation of Brockhampton at the time, what it was like for them to be that high on the fucking pedestal, because it was like, you know, the Beatles obviously are the fucking Beatles. I have a fucking poster of them in my fucking room, for God's sake. But, you know, at the time, that was what it must have felt like from these fucking kids who came from nowhere, Texas, and were suddenly thrust into the throes of fame. And I just love, I love the whiplash, the way this record just constantly shifts gears, make it feel so fluid and dynamic and exciting. And that's why I love returning to it, is that it never endangers of boring me, or not even boring me, of just not captivating me utterly. I will come to the defense of something about him, in that I just do think it's sort of a sweet ode of Kevin to his longtime partner at the time. But this sort of first stretch of the record here, to me, is an intentional subversion of the structure of the Saturation albums. It basically, this is the short song that would be mirrored by something like Jesus or something like Tupac on the Saturation albums, that served as a sort of very brief digression. And it gets at the broader point here of what I think they're doing with the sort of first third of this album, which I think is pretty undeniably the most messy, as it just shifts its gears so often. That said, I think it's Brockhampton demonstrating the fact that they're kind of in denial. They're trying to make saturation again. They're trying to make that lightning in a bottle again, but this omnipresent loss, this thing that's tainted them, has infected them. It's infected them to the point where even the synths don't sound like synths. They sound evil and sour and messy and weird. And this sort of extends into that. This is just them going through beats that they've already gone through, but more instrumentally captivating and wild. The artificialness of saturation is part of its charm, but it's not here. It's them being way more adventurous and throwing everything at the wall and showing how they've grown, but also how they felt and just how chaotic it was, intentionally mirroring that until you hit Wait. And up until this point, it's sort of like them in denial over and over again, being like, oh, this is us making a saturation song, but different. This is us making a saturation song, but different. And then, of course, you do also hit songs like Where the Cash At, which I'm in the Morgan camp here of just finding this to be raucously fucking fun. That said, I do think it serves an important thematic contribution, in the sense that Merlin is talking about, where the cash at, you used to ask that. It's dwelling on the fact that he used to be poor, but now has money, but also the instinctiveness of which they are sort of rattling off these hip hop cliches about money, which is later reprised on the record in when they talk about, I think it's on Jover actually, where, suitcase on my way to the bank. They keep talking about these things as if they're almost on autopilot, except there's always this thing to the side where it's just like, oh, we're singing about, like robbing people and getting money and getting rich like we did on Saturation, but we have money now. We have success. We have this. They're doing these things because it's instinctual to them. It's because they've grown up to do this automatically. It's an epitome of an Amir verse on Saturation 2, I believe, where he says, I'll be a pop star even if I say the same things, because those same things put me on the wavelengths. This is them channeling the wavelengths. And then, of course, you go immediately into Wait, which I can't really elaborate on any better than we already have. In some respects, I've already spoken on it. But it's just another hard right turn that the album takes, but this is sort of the tone setter for what the album truly becomes. It's just Kevin spilling out all of these anxieties that he's facing, that the band is facing, band members. It's incredible. And the way he sort of speaks to his experience growing up as a kid who didn't fully understand his sexuality is heartbreaking. The sort of bridge, where he screams or talks about screaming, but the vocals become sung as if it's just, it's a musical metaphor for his exact description. I don't want to waste no more time. I'm ready to go. I put my life on standby. I can leave you alone. And then the just fucking break into it. I also think Joba here is fucking terrific, as he always is, but the sort of half-sung quality he has, but it perfectly rides this insane beat. The and also sort of hinting at the sort of overall themes of the record, because we're born with a dollar sign attached to our temple. Life is a dish served cold most times, and all my life I've taken handfuls, force-fed by the hand that feeds us, but not all hands are created equal. I stand by waiting for something good to come. In due time, the skies will split for the sun to smile. And then you go into Dom's verse, which is where I said that I wouldn't tell a sad story, but I will say as much that since Iridescence came out, this has been an album that has been intrinsically linked to every bad thing that's ever happened to me, because it's my comfort music. It's these songs are in my DNA. I hear them 5 seconds before they happen. They are implanted in who I am. It's one of the few albums that I can feel that I almost can listen to without actually hearing it. And there are moments that capture a very specific thing, like when Dom talks about being separated from his mother or his family. And this album came out during a time where I was involved with someone who lived in another country, who lived across the ocean. And every time he speaks to being separate from the people that he loves the most in the world, it fucking rips apart my insides. I just remembered feeling that, because it was just like, that engulfed my life for the entire year that we were together, is that it was just this feeling of distance, of a lack of connection, that even in the age where we can call people at the drop of a hat, you could still feel so fucking far away from some people. And Dom, being the poet that he is basically puts that better than anybody could. And then we go into the next song after Wait, which is District. And District gets a bit of a bad rap, I think. From online, I've seen a lot of people say that this is like a song that sort of tries to be really chaotic and messy and just sort of ends up being nothing but that. But the sort of moment that it builds to, where you hear the glass shatter and the beat just sort of spool out at the end, and the title of the song, District, and the way that sort of ends in sort of this dreamy way, where you hear that sort of processed pitched vocals say, sitting on a porch, cross parking lots, light it up, dodge the cops, never get sick of playing with your locks. Yeah, I miss you lots. It's sort of breaking to get into that sort of dreamier moment where the vocals, there's also sort of a refrain that's sort of sliding in and out of that passage. And the way it breaks, and the fact that it's called District, it's a song about being confined. It's about feeling claustrophobic and then breaking through, and it's so fucking cathartic.
Yeah.
And
that last part of the song with Bareface's pitch shifted vocals singing that refrain, it just guts me. Like, it sounds so lonely, and
it's the way he's singing it. It sounds like it should be on like an indie pop record by someone who's making a whole album of incredibly nostalgic, lonely, melancholy music, but he's doing it as a coda of this hip hop song, and it just completely changes the dynamic in an amazing way.
Yeah. And there's just so many singular moments on this. It's a basically structureless song that just allows everybody to sort of bob and weave in and out of their own strengths. I think Matt's verse here goes a little unsung. This is a verse that is just cold-blooded in delivery, but very fine-tunedly explains the whole they're successful, but it didn't solve all their problems thing. Money walk and money talk, but money no make you comfortable. Big ass house and a big ass car don't add up when you die alone. And the whole verse is like that. And there's constant references to parasites by every single member of the band throughout the entire album, which I think is sort of indicative of the way they viewed fame at this point, as being sort of a parasite that they didn't expect it to be. And then after that, you go into Loophole, which obviously it's the sort of interview that I think is integral, sort of emphasizing this theme of the album that's very, very prominent. But then we go into Tape, which just immediately starts off with Kevin's flow, which is absolutely insane. An incredibly honest verse from him, talking about how he feels guilty about some of the stuff that he talked about in regards to his mother, about how maybe he exaggerated things in his music to paint her as being homophobic, to paint her as being unsupportive, when maybe in reality she wasn't that way. He said in an interview once that he feels terrible because his parents will show up to a concert and they know every word of the songs, even the words where he is intentionally talking shit about them. And at this point, Kevin reconciles with himself about that and is talking about how watching his mother's health degrade has emphasized on how bad that has felt to him. And not to mention, there's also the bridge here, which sort of talks about the reminiscence of what started Brockhampton, and it just so really accurately captures what it's like to be a passionate artist with a project, writing rhymes in the dentist office, stuff like that just really gets to the heart of what I love about creating art, and sort of kind of gets to, I don't know, something super identifiable that I feel like I've felt before. And I've already mentioned that I think this is Joba's finest hour. I think this might even be the best verse on the album, which I read it in its entirety. It's great. I love how it's sort of soury and more down-tempo jazz thing when Matt Champion's verse comes in, which, again, super underrated. And then the album goes into the next song, which is Joubert, which is just a virtuosic display of emotional delivery on account of Joba. The thing I love about this song the most isn't even how hard he goes. It's that he escalates himself on a bar by bar basis to the point where he gets at like an emotional temperature that you think is just like, oh my God, this is him at his angriest. And then he tops it again for those last couple lines. And it's so unexpected. It surprises me like every single time I hear it. And it's so fucking passionate. And I love it. It's just a fucking incredible fucking verse. And yeah, I love pretty much everything about the song that follows. I will give some love to some tracks that did not get some universal appraisal, especially Honey here. Honey is a song that I feel like really begins with this almost psychedelic kind of dreamy, expansive beginning. And man, in the middle of this fucking song where that Beyonce sample is worked in and it just sort of blooms and blossoms and you sort of hear those vocal harmonies being like, oh, it's so fucking good, man. I love the song. And not to mention Dom on both Honey and Vivid, absolutely on fire, especially when he's talking about just Dom talking about the current rap game and sort of violence and sort of inner city like school shootings and whatnot. Brockhampton always been a conscious band. It's haven't really shown that's part of it on this record that much so, but it does it in the way that relates it to him emotionally, just because this is something that Dom always speaks to, that really gets to the core of some of the issues that he likes to talk about. And then there's Vivid, which is also just another cold ass song. I love Matt Champion's verse at the very beginning. And I love the sort of Dom, again, with the opening lines of radiation is present, got my reflection iridescent. Every little moment I step in might shift the planet's direction. Just sort of, that's the mindset of this sort of, I think the high of all of this was just, you got to make a record this quickly. And it was like, you have all this money and all this shit in your hands. It was like, you feel powerful, but also you feel weak. And I love the, I don't give a fuck about freshmen. I don't give a fuck about veterans. If your perception ain't ascending, then there's no reason to extend it. And it just gets more and more and more intense. It basically lays the groundwork for his verse on Dearly Departed, where like the second half is just him fucking yelling, and it's so fucking intense. And yeah, then we get to the final 3 tracks. San Marcos. What an unreal left turn this song was when I first heard it. I remember being outside my community college when I first heard this, driving around in my car as I played it right after I got the leak. And this just sort of, it stops you dead in your tracks with the processed vocals, which I always took as being sort of a indication of Matt being high, just because he talks about drinking and also being on oxy in the first part of the verse. But the way the lonesome guitar just sort of leads you in here, and then Kevin's bridge, it's so perfectly structured. And Bareface's vocals on this are just absolutely outstanding. You remember why he's the person they used to close out the Saturation records on each time. I would also like to point out that Dom's verse here is pretty ferocious. Specifically the part "trying to catch me liberating spirits from the gallows" is a line that is said by Dom himself to be about lynchings, which is intense when you look into it, especially some of the notes that he's got on Genius. But I think the moment in his verse that hits me the hardest is, of course, the "could be stronger than vibranium. It doesn't mean that I'm not fragile," which just captures the fucking clashing dual nature of this perfectly. But yeah, Joba's verse is the one. It is the moment. Specifically, "I'm afraid of commitment. I don't know how to fix it. Maybe codependent. Can't tell the difference. But when push comes to shove, I'd rather bend than break. Something's gotta give. Ain't that what they say? When you're torn between reality and a choice you could have made or should have made, they're not the same. I'm not the same. Maybe I'm broken. Either way, I'm clinging on closely." And who I can't like even point to one specific area in my life where that has not been insanely fucking prescient. In fact, it's only become more of a lyric that I almost hate it, because it's like I feel called out, frankly. And
Russell,
the end, just
sir, Russell,
Yeah.
sir.
Please,
Just
Mr. Boring.
Just to add something here, the music that's going on in the background, like in terms of music, like theory, it's simple enough that I could have feasibly written it, and I know fuck all about music theory. Compared to the rest of the record, it's incredibly simple what they're doing with the music, but it's all the more effective for that, really.
Yeah, that's why San Marcos is such a show-stopping moment that I think catches people off guard, and the way that it builds that simplicity and then ends with the cathartic release of "I want more out of life than this," which is just, I mean, fuck, when the hell have I never thought that? Really? Just every step in the evolution of being a human being involves me at one point saying, I want this to be better. And
yeah,
it feels like a cry of defeat. It feels like something that you might say when you're at a low point, but the way it's said here is triumphant, not as an admission, but almost as a declaration.
An affirmation of ambition.
Yes, it is a declaration. And then you build perfectly off of the emotional high from that, and you go to Tanya, which is my favorite Brockhampton song. And if you asked me before September of 2020, I would have told you that it was my favorite song ever. And yeah, this song hurts. It begins, of course, with the incredibly lonesome, iconic fucking piano line and the Bareface's sort of strained intro of "Mother, I'm sorry I never pick up because I'm afraid to disappoint you." And then the sort of, "Hey, I've been feeling like I don't matter how I used to." Again, never not been relevant. And then there's the sort of, down-tempo Bareface verse where he doesn't focus on the sort of tranquility and beauty of his voice as he normally does, and just sort of uses it to take a moment. And then there's Kevin's verse, which I've been in my feelings on an island in the dirt. I feel like brothers lie just so my feelings don't get hurt. I said I'll try vacation. I'll try to run away. I deleted Facebook. I'll trade fame any day for a quiet Texas place and a barbecue plate. And this leads to my story, is that at the very beginning of 2019, I went on vacation to Florida. This was immediately after Kevin Abstract's solo album, Arizona Baby, came out. So I was listening to that a lot at the time. And needless to say, I was also listening to Brockhampton just because it was sort of in between these things, and I knew that there was something else on the way, and I'm always listening to them. And that sort of album is very summery, and going to Florida, going to the beach, that's sort of the mindset you want to be in. So I was listening a lot to that. And during this time, it was after the person I was in a long distance relationship with for a year that we had broken up, but we were still very much talking to each other because the breakup was it was amicable, but it just got to be that the distance became too much, and that left us in a precarious position because it meant that we both had compromised mental healths and we had depended on each other for so long. So you can't just split and break like that. So we were kind of in a stage where we were still talking about that, but it was still weighing heavily on my mind. I was having to deal with the fact that I had left someone who, if they were on the same continent as me, I could have spent the rest of my life with them. And that was something that was very hard to accept. So I was listening to lots of music that made me contemplate those things. And then one night just changed everything. And it starts with the person in this podcast who is gone right now. It starts with Morgan. For whatever reason, Morgan talked to me about Carly Rae Jepsen's Emotion, an album I had not heard up until this point. And he was just like, he sent me like a screenshot of a rating he'd given it and was just like, I do not remember this album being fucking perfect, but it is. And I was just like, I've never heard it. I'll throw it on. And basically it was in the middle of my vacation, which was a very lax thing. But it was nighttime in Florida. There was a steady sea breeze going, and I had to go and get some stuff for the people we were staying there with. I had to go get some groceries. So I put that on my car, and into this place right next to the beach, I just sort of drove and put on that record. And boy howdy, I cannot tell you the emotional high you get when you listen to pop of that specifically emotional nature, and you're just driving through like a beach, which feels like a dreamland, and you roll down your windows and you can fucking smell the ocean, and it just feels like you're in a fucking movie. And I'm sitting there and I drive and I go into the store and I get everything, and then I come back to my car and I put my phone in the aux, and I don't know why, but I put on San Marcos. I didn't listen to the whole album. I just put that song on and I drove, but I took the long way home because I wanted to drive next to the highway where I could see the entirety of the beach. And I did. And I listened to San Marcos on the way there, and I was a bit teary. And then Tanya comes up, and I just sort of took this moment, and I was driving, and the song starts, and I'm listening to it, and I'm getting very caught up in the moment. And as soon as Joba's bridge comes in, which is, and maybe it means nothing, but I have to say I think about you often. And if you want no part with me, I'll walk away. I know that I've wronged you. And maybe it means nothing, but I have to say I think about you often. And that lyric reached inside my soul, and that was what I was feeling at the time with the person that I had separated from. And I had to stop the car. I had to park in a parking lot right next to the beach, and I just couldn't move. And the rest of the song played. And eventually I just had to get out of the car. And once you get to Dom's verse, where he talks about being separated from his dad, his sister, his mother, his brother, it just kind of hit, and I took my phone out and I walked, and I put in my earbuds and I walked down to the beach, and I just sort of stood there and looked. The tide just kind of kept rolling in, and then I hear Merlin's verse, which talks about one of my favorite little bars is "so sour in this light of lime," but also "Daddy said study or get that cash. Mommy said your career ain't gonna last. Loose change, call a cab, move out of their pad. I just need a chance to move past my past. Don't think too fast. Private jets still crash." And something about that, particularly the line, "I need a chance to move past my past," just hit, and I just kind of sat there and I let the song go. I don't even think I registered the rest of the lyrics. I just remembered the beautiful vocal harmonies of Bareface at the very end and Matt Champion screaming at the top of his lungs. And it just sort of fades out. And then Fabric comes in, which is like this little epilogue. And I was just sort of left there, sitting there all alone at night, looking at the ocean, and I laughed. I don't know why. I don't know if maybe it was because I couldn't, maybe it was a frustrated thing, but I think I just looked at the comic absurdity of being in that moment and that situation and listening to those songs and being like, God, this is so fucking corny. Of course this is what I'm doing. And I just kind of laughed. And then I went back to my car and I drove home just in a contemplative silence. And ever since that night, this album has not been songs to me. It's one musical event that happens, and I put it on and I listen to it, and it's like I don't hear music anymore. I just feel it. I understand it. It talks to me, and I talk back to it, and I get it. And it's so messy. It's so fucking flawed. It has moments that just don't flow into one another, whiplash, and obviously moments that stand out above other moments, just head and shoulders. It is the piece of art that is the most flawed, that I love the most. Nothing, like, you can evaluate everything in your life, and everything, even your most perfect unimaginable thing, you can pick 1 second of it apart that you don't like or that doesn't hit you like the other parts do. But Iridescence is something special because it makes me love it more than most things, despite being the odd black sheep bastard stepchild that it is of an album. And I don't know, man, listening to it puts me in a different time, a different place, and I've used it as a comfort album for everything bad that has happened to me since then, and I've always used it. And some albums fade out of that in time. Sometimes I can just listen to things with a bit more of fresh ears now. Sometimes they stay that way. Like I can listen to Brand New in a band that sort of did that for me a long time ago, but I can listen to them from a purely more evaluative standpoint. On a way that doesn't get at me like it was when I first went to college. But this music specifically, this has not faded in that regard. Its emotions have remained poignant and messy and weird, and they are me and I am them, and it is everything I like about art and music and all of these things congealed into this messy fucking scrapbook of pain and emotions and torment, and it's fucking beautiful. And it's a color I can't quite describe, but it has indeed made whatever darkness I have experienced as close to divine as any human being can come. So for that reason, it is my favorite hip hop album, even though it is far, far from the most perfect one.
Beautifully said, as ever.
Yeah, well done.
Okay.
Really.
Well, on that note, shall we move into our favorite tracks and ratings?
I suppose so.
On what better note could we, really?
Well, I guess it seems fitting that Jay go last again, just to kind of build that up. So I'll go first. My three favorite tracks are Tonya, Tape, and Wait. My least favorite track is probably Something About Him. And the record gets an 8 out of 10 from me.
8. So for me, my three favorite tracks are Jouvert, San Marcos, and Tonya. I don't really have a least favorite track. I didn't bother to pick one in advance, and I'm not going to do it now. And the record's getting a 10 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, boy.
My three, excuse me. My three favorites are Tanya, say Thug Life and Tape. Least favorite, Something About Him, and I'm feeling a 9.5.
Oh, fuck yeah. I'm here for this.
You know what? So am I.
Yeah, right.
I'm gonna take a controversial stance and say I'm here for my own rating.
Yeah. Anyway, my three favorite tracks are Tape, Wait, and Tanya. My least favorite is New Orleans. I'd give it a 6 out of 10.
You know what? You gave that to the Cardiacs, so
he held the pillow upside down there, I think.
Yeah.
Let's not get so high, Mr. 8 out of 10.
That's true. That's true. You got me. That's fair.
But yeah, my three favorite tracks are San Marcos, Tanya, and God, it's still so fucking hard. Tape. Least favorite. I probably do have a least favorite, but fuck it, man. I don't care. It's a 10.
Yeah, right? So that's an 8.7 overall. And I shall tell you what it shares company with. And that is one record. Gang of Youths, Go Farther and Lightness.
Baby, let's go.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah.
Both albums that came to me in the worst year of my life. Let's go.
We were depressed in 2017 and 18.
Yes. Well, that sums up our record club for this week. Make sure you tune into next week's record club, which is going to be
very different.
A mess of a very different kind, as we'll be discussing the Shag's infamous philosophy of the world.
And if it's as long as this episode, I might die on air.
Morgan is officially filing his
pass
2-week
away.
notice for the Jams and Tea podcast.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm like so very excited to discuss philosophy of the world.
Am I excited to listen to it multiple times for the podcast? I don't know.
It's just it's one of the greatest albums ever, you know.
It was one of Kurt Cobain's favorite records.
Anyway, if you're a Brockhampton fan, or let us know what you think about Iridescence in the comments below. Let us know what your feelings are. What's your favorite Brockhampton record? Feel free to drop a ranking in the comments if you want to. Hit us up on our Twitter. Obviously, you know which ones of us to hit up directly if you want to talk about Brockhampton.
And if you don't know, all of our handles are in the description.
Correct. And so rock over London. Rock on Chicago.
Chicago.
Mountain Dew.
Do.
The Dew.